Okay, let's kick off. We're pretty much on the hour. Welcome everyone to this Torch bite-sized talk. As the evening wears on, I'm starting to struggle with this TT, Torch Talk. Let me tell you something about Torch, just for a moment. Torch is the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and we have been involved in putting on this spectacle, this FRIGHT Friday for you tonight. Everything that we do rests on our research, and these talks feature some of the research of Oxford academics and scholars. So it gives me great pleasure to turn now to introduce our, fourth talk of the evening, which is on, let me just get this right, which is on Gothic Medicine, Fear and Flesh. And giving this talk is Barry Murname, who is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages and Fellow and Tutor in German at St. John's College. He's published widely on European literature and culture from the 1700s to the present day, and he's particularly interested in concepts of modernity and modernization, technology, and also the medical humanities, as I think we're about to find out. His first book was on Franz Kafka, but he's also written on Gothic literature, popular culture, and medical history. And he's currently working on a book that explores the relationship between literature and pharmacy in the 18th and 19th centuries. So who could be better to tell us about Gothic medicine? Please join me in welcoming Barry Murname.
Thank you very much, Elika. So there are probably plenty of people who could talk about this, and there'll be another talk immediately after this which will do an equally great job at this, and from a medical perspective. So take anything I've said with a caveat in terms of the medicine for now. Today I want to talk to you about a topic I call Gothic medicine, and I'll be looking at the interactions between literary history and medical history. And I'll start by introducing, first of all, what the Gothic is, and then discuss what Gothic medicine might mean, before looking then at some of the ways in which the relationship between Gothic and medicine may have changed. If we're talking about Gothic medicine, the first question is actually, what do we mean by Gothic? And we all have a pretty good sense of what the Gothic is, I think. It's a form of fiction and latterly film that focuses on supernatural figures like ghosts, monsters, vampires, etc. It spans different genres and also historical periods. And it focuses on uncanny effects, on generating an affect of horror in the reader. The Gothic is said to start in the middle of the 18th century, pretty much because the guy we say invented the Gothic tells us that he did so himself, Horace Walpole, with The Castle of Otranto, the first Gothic novel. And although it appears to go out of fashion in the course of the 19th century, it remains as a kind of a shadow of modernity and a shadow of modernization, and emerges again after periods in which it kind of resurfaces in writers like Dickens or Stevenson with a vengeance around 1900, with writers like Franz Kafka in texts like Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in German expressionist movies like Nosferatu, or US productions like James Whale's Frankenstein. The Gothic maintains a constant presence then throughout the 20th century, and we're all familiar with names that we'd associate with the Gothic. People like Stephen King, people like Anne Rice, Interview with a Vampire. But there are a whole host of contemporary zombie, vampire, spectral stories being told in popular neoliberal TV at the minute as well. And I'm going to get around to talking about one of those examples towards the end, In the Flesh, a BBC Three production a few years ago that focuses on what happens after the zombie apocalypse. And I want to suggest that Gothic is about this supernatural, but these fantastic features are actually a way of negotiating some of the contradictions that emerge in the course of social modernization. Figures like the ghosts, like monsters, most recently zombies, are figures that are used to talk about problems that emerge in the course of social modernization. And by that I mean contradictions in terms of our sense of identities, our social politics, in terms of technology, our relationship to industrialization. And we can usefully think about the Gothic, I think, as a shadow of the modern, a black box recording the contradictions that emerge in the process of modernization and industrialization. It opens them up to debate, it opens them up to view and thinks critically about them and helps us to think critically about them. Where liberal Western society generates simplifying narratives of progress and expansion, Gothic's mechanisms question the dominant cultural and political narratives by stealth, as a story like Frankenstein shows us only too clearly. But what about Gothic medicine? The fascination of the dead coming back to life, of disturbing the borders between death and life, is central to the narratives of Gothic horror. And of course, attempting to halt the dying process and manage the dying process is central to our narratives of modern medicine too. As a cultural practice, medicine embodies an acknowledgement of human mortality and a dogged resistance to its inevitable course, dependent both philosophically and financially upon the continued presence of illness and disease. Medicine is committed to their eradication. Medical practice makes painful interventions in order to extend lives. And the experience of illness is often one where our own bodies seem to become strangely other to us, no longer doing what we intend, what we want them to do, no longer under our rational control. These are contradictions and experiences that are developed with acute awareness in Gothic narratives and depictions of graphic suffering and pathology. And the sense of strangeness and uncanniness in our medical experiences of ourselves is often an uncanny one. And that's what Gothic medicine tries to address. So thinking about the interactions between literary history and medical history, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein seems like an obvious place to start. But it would be wrong to ignore some of the other earlier medical texts around 1800 in the Gothic. And there are other key texts that are worth noting. Pharmaceuticals and poisons are a central concern within Gothic around 1800, and narratives like Matthew Lewis's The Monk or Anne Radcliffe's novels deploy the use of medicines, drugs, and poisoning and intoxication as plot features. They're tools that enable the sexual depravity of the eponymous monk in Matthew Lewis's novel. And Radcliffe frequently uses poisons to dispose of her villains, such as the Father Schedoni in The Italian, in order to reintroduce a sense of order. But Frankenstein is the most obvious. With its tale of the overly ambitious and morally careless anatomist, alchemist Victor Frankenstein, the novel quite clearly responds to fears of medical interventions into reproduction and anatomy. But one point which is quite interesting in the way in which the novel also responds to early techniques of life extension. And this is much less frequently commented upon. Suspended states of animation and processes of reanimation are everywhere in Shelley's novel. Victor falls into a comatose state, which he describes as lifeless, after animating his creature, and he's, quote, restored to life by Clerval. Elizabeth is, quote, restored with extreme difficulty by Victor after finding William's corpse. The creature tells of his efforts to restore animation to a girl who had drowned in a river. And here we can see some of the scenes from the various history and various different versions of Frankenstein in this respect. Death in Frankenstein, it seems, can be reversed. And this opens up a source of liminal horror that runs to the heart of the story. In animating the creature, Victor seems to reactivate a life force that continues to exist in the bodily remains that he sews together. There's a real medical and personal context to this as well. For Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley, much has been done to trace out their links to romantic science, but Mary and Percy were surrounded by doctors with an interest in what in the age was called apparent death. It was a new phenomenon of suspended animation noticed first around 1786 in Holland, victims who'd fallen into frozen canals and were then revived. And one of the key doctors involved in this debate and introducing this debate into England was Percy Shelley's personal physician in 1817, James Curry. And there's a very telling moment at the start of Frankenstein when Victor is revived by Walton from the frozen north. And it's almost as if he needs to be revived in order for his story to be told in Shelley's narrative. And there's something strange that's happening there. Shelley's narrative seems to become a kind of a cryonic process itself. It records and keeps Victor's life story going over and over again. Of course, the most obvious moment of horror in Shelley's Gothicized version of life extension is where Victor's scientific ideals run up against the brutal reality of the body. One problem in particular is the contradiction between his idealist aims and the actual brutality of his handiwork. He admits that he deals in corpses and body parts, spending days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. That's a quote. He spends his days in, quote, the dissecting room in the slaughterhouse, that often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation. But Victor blinds this out to focus on the ideal bounds of reanimating and creating life. It's only when the body parts are reanimated that he recognizes the actual horrific corporeal actuality of his creation, that which he had suppressed behind the image of his ideal bounds of creating life. Quote, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart at the sight of the dull yellow eye and yellow skin scarcely covering the work of muscles and arteries underneath. I could proceed through the 19th century and pick out various different texts. And of course, you could talk about Quincy's Confessions of an Opium Eater. You could talk about Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the story of duplicity and psychology there. I could continue on to look at William Burroughs' Naked Lunch and the psychotic worlds there that are linked to psychopharmaca. I could talk about Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, an incredibly interesting text in terms of psychopharmaca, depression, anatomy as much as anything else, violence, bodily suffering. Several recently successful graphic novels, films, television series likewise focus on medicine as the core of their engagement with contemporary culture. The first film in the Resident Evil series starts with an infective agent produced by the shady pharmaceutical concern, the Umbrella Corporation. Channel 4's amazing series, if you haven't seen it, watch it on their player. Channel 4's amazing series, Utopia, is based around a pharmaceutical conspiracy that involves a pseudo-inoculation designed to racially control the population. Trump as Frankenstein is waiting there. Michael Bay's The Island, the Pang brothers' Jan Gui, Xavier Palude's The Eye, Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, Stephen Frear's Dirty Pretty Things. These all look at organ harvesting and transplant procedures as uncanny and disturbing medical processes. And we can see some of the images from these series here. Figures in pods, bred and kept in a coma for organ harvesting in Michael Crichton's film of the same name, Coma, from 1978. In different ways, these novels and films show the mobility of body parts between bodies and across rational boundaries. And they illuminate the dark side of the organ trade and neoliberal globalization. And that's one of the key narratives, I think, in Gothic medicine at present, is linking it to neoliberal organizations. The interchangeability of body parts is horrifying because it creates new intimacies between strangers and is often constructed on the basis of illicit trade or by extracting organs from the poor for rejuvenation of the privileged. And here it's quite interesting to see a train in Gothic where it's now being produced in countries which we wouldn't normally associate it with and in areas in which we wouldn't normally associate. Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, countries to which it isn't usually linked. And here it's being used in terms of carrying out the relationship between the global south and the global north, where the organ trade and the sufferers of the organ trade are always from the global south. And they're developing narratives in which to make that obvious, questioning the narratives of modernization and medical progress. The many accounts of modern medical practice also suggest that medical treatment and biotechnology might even maintain an inherently uncanny logic themselves. And that's another thing I mean by Gothic medicine. Many patients' real case histories and their own personal stories generate experiences of an uncanny, pathological alterity in themselves, a sense of them being other to themselves. Contemporary techniques of life-extending medicine procedures like blood transfusion, intensive care, and psychopharmaceutical treatments are experienced as uncanny and decentering in themselves. Medics and philosophers of bioethics alike deploy linguistic registers previously the domain of the Gothic to describe and discuss medical phenomena, such as organ transplant, life support, prostheses. David Price speaks of the twilight zone of organ transplant. The Exeter Protocol on brain death speaks of ventilating dead bodies. And when Margaret Locke describes the way that, quote, patients remain betwixt and between, both alive and dead, quote, end quote, she points towards their, quote, hybrid states, that of the dead person in a living body, all of that hyphenated. One cannot fail to notice a moment of slippage here. What was once the domain of fiction has now become a Gothic reality in its own life, it seems. Such scenarios are also the backdrop to Dominic Mitchell's post-zombie apocalypse drama In the Flesh. And if you haven't seen this, it is absolutely essential viewing to understand what current Gothic cultural production is about. BBC Three series, it's no longer available on the iPlayer, but you can buy it on DVD, and I would recommend incredibly highly to do so. These images are taken from that series. Set in the Lancashire village of Wharton, the series depicts life after the so-called Pale Wars, where armed militias of the living, the so-called human volunteer force, waged war with thousands of deceased who had risen from the grave and were reanimated as rabid zombies in the Rising. So far, so good. The story is picked up by Kieran Walker, and Kieran's a teenager who's committed suicide after his friend and probably lover Rick Macy was shipped off to serve in Afghanistan, where he also dies. And he returns back to Wharton. And he, like others among the undead, weren't actually killed by the human volunteer force, but they ended up being treated with a new medication called neurotriptyline in a private institution in Norfolk. And here we can see the treatment where it's injected into the spine. This is the private institution in Norfolk. Neurotriptyline kickstarts neurochemical production and hence begins to artificially regenerate the ability of the undead to think rationally and to control their murderous urges. Having regained consciousness and become christened as PDS, sufferers, partially deceased syndrome, and they've been provided with cosmetics to give themselves a healthy complexion. They get contact lenses to cover, because their eyes look really weird, but they're given contact lenses to cover over the weirdness of their eyes and make them look normal. And then they're released back into society with daily doses of medication to suppress their thirst for brains. Kieran and the other undead are placed back in the communities to reintegrate, but not much happens. They're left to their own devices. And as the series In the Flesh seems less to be about the shock of the zombies, the problem seems to be that Kieran and the others are no longer human, but also no longer fully other due to the pharmaceutical normalization. And the plot of the series is all about the relationships between and surrounding these medically induced hybrid figures. In particular, the pharmacological status of the undead seems to be the literal embodiment of such practices of remaking life and death that we speak of in postmodernity, albeit in reverse. Generating life where there was death. Neurotriptyline rebalances and kickstarts the neurochemical functioning of the brainstem, generating new brain cells and brain activity, as an educational film called Understanding PDS tells us, and thereby recreating the consciousness. And all of this stuff is produced by the NHS, and they're all treated by the NHS. But of course, the NHS is caught up in a public-private partnership, and it's costing a lot of money. It's far too familiar for us to think of this as being fantastic literature anymore. The pharmacological preparation is reminiscent of newer practices of regenerative medicine, where neurochemical adjustment, tissue engineering, and genetic reprogramming are deployed to simulate cellular activity and literally produce new neuronal life, such as in the treatment of Alzheimer's. And it's worth noting that there is actually a tricyclical antidepressant called nortriptyline, which is also used to treat various anxiety disorders, neuropathology, and actually increasingly ADHD patients too. Kieran and the other PDS sufferers seem to occupy a necropolitical selfhood, which reveals itself as disturbingly familiar, an uncanny version of an already uncanny state produced by today's neoliberal medicine. Indeed, neurotriptyline and the accompanying health and education program all have the appearances of a PPP. Halperin and Weston, company here in the box, produces, markets, and educates patients and carers alike, while dining out on the profits drawn from the NHS buying drugs on, which it has the sole patent. They might be the zombies, but who are the vampires in this narrative? Yeah? Perhaps it's possible to say that the Gothic, as a shadow of modernity, only actually develops the already uncanny, disturbing features of medicine itself in its fictions. And perhaps these fictions are no longer required to generate these narratives. And if that's the case, and if we do have such a neoliberal Gothic reality in terms of this medical culture, perhaps it's no wonder that zombies and vampires and monsters and ghosts seem to be everywhere in the cultural production of the present day, from Twilight to The Walking Dead to series like In the Flesh. They are already key components of our current medical practices. Thank you very much.